today it's seen as a respectable thing to be a theist. And there are a number of atheists like Thomas Nagel and others who will say, I'm very uncomfortable that a number of my colleagues at the best schools are committed Christians or theists.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Good Theology podcast brought to you, today by our presenting sponsor, Dwell Bible. Since launching in 2018, Dwell's mission has been to help Christians rediscover the ancient practice of listening to Scripture, which I highly recommend through their beautiful digital experience. Dwell offers more than 20 handpicked voices across 11 translations, New American Standard, NIV, King James, ESV, and the International Children's Bible, and lots more. Now, Dwell has built a platform to help pastors and leaders. So if you're a pastor or a church leader and you're listening to this podcast, listen up, because they have a platform now to help keep people rooted in God's word every day, the people that you're leading and shepherding. You can invite your church with easy-to-use tools and share built-by-you scripture playlists and plans to encourage reflection on last Sunday's sermon, or keep up with your church's Bible reading plan, wherever they find themselves in that. Dwell offers a 30-day trial on all new accounts, and you can get started by going to dwellbible.com/good or texting the word good to 39383. Again, that's dwellbible.com/good or texting the word good to 39383. And we are grateful to Dwell. Thank you so much for sponsoring our show. We love you guys. I personally use the app and do find it very, very helpful to listen to Scripture, which is wonderfully supplemental to reading it as well. So today I am here joined by everybody's favorite person, the one and only David Campbell. David, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Apart from having a cold.
You sure it's not COVID?
Well, you never know these days. I caught it in Nashville visiting the Theos.
It's definitely COVID then. And we are also joined by Corey Stephenson, who is a friend of David Campbell's and now a friend of mine. Corey, so good to have you on Good Theology, man. Welcome.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Good to see you guys.
So Corey is joining us today because we have a unique episode. Normally we talk about all things faith and culture, and I'm sure certainly this conversation will delve into some of that as well, but with a specific twist, because Corey has a master's in philosophy, a master's in theology, and a emphasis, a focus, a passion on the traditional apologetics realm. And so we're going to try to delve into that subject today and talk about some apologetic things. Yeah. So if you're into that, you're really going to enjoy today's conversation. So Corey, why don't you kick us off, man, and just share a little bit about how this became your passion. Maybe tell us, an abbreviated version of your journey.
Yeah, let's spend 40 minutes on that, shall we? No, I'm just kidding.
Believe it or not, I've done episodes with people before, and almost the entirety of the episode becomes their story. Yeah. So I've learned my lesson of just condense it.
If you have a little horn or a button you can press, if I'm not quick enough, just interject.
I'll try to do a sound effect, which I'm not great at.
Yeah. All right. A little bit about my story. I grew up in a nominal Christian home. My parents went to church growing up, but it was just tradition for them. So there wasn't much in the home. It was more so my extended family that impacted me, my aunt especially. Church was more important to them. They had a life of faith. So I started going to church more consistently in junior high and high school. I was baptized around junior high and started to take my faith more seriously. Of course, going to church once a week and then being immersed in a secular public school, playing video games and watching TV shows didn't have the most impact on me. But there were a number of people who poured into my life. One lady in particular started Bible study with with us. So, I began to take it more seriously in high school. But of course, like so many, being in largely a post-Christian world, you're going to meet up against people with differing views. Like, hey, you believe in God? Like, that's weird. Like, isn't God an old man in the sky? Or what about evolution? Like, so these things, naturally came up, with fellow students. And I don't know how it happened. I want to say it was providential, but I remember Googling, arguments for God's existence or something like that. And I remember coming across one of my heroes and one of the people I got to study with, at Biola doing philosophy, William Lane Craig, who,
no big deal.
No big deal. Yeah. He's kind of a big name in this world. But I came across him and started watching some of his debates, and during my spares in high school, I would listen to his Defenders podcast. And this is like, who has a Sunday school lesson where they're talking about timelessness and arguments for God's existence? So I would listen to his apologetics and systematic theology stuff. And
so you have kind of a natural proclivity towards this. It's something that naturally interests you.
Yeah, well, it was around that time I started asking the big existential questions, and I thought they were so weird. I thought I was weird, to be honest. I remember talking to my uncle, who was well read. He was one of the Christians at my church. I grew up going to a low church, largely evangelical, but he was a well read guy, and I remember telling him about these things, like, hey, like, like, why does it matter? I make my bed, I do go about life, and I come back, and I do the same thing over. Like, what's this about? Like, where's it going? Like, if God doesn't exist, does my life have objective meaning and purpose? Is it going anywhere? Or, so I started asking all these big questions, which are, if you read through the Bible, you find that in things like Ecclesiastes is right there. So I started thinking more about apologetics and stuff like that through just this existential sense of, hungering for God and realizing that it really makes a difference if God exists or not for my life. So that was kind of my opening. And, it was one of those things in public school where I didn't have really an outlet for that. And it's kind of a shame that we don't teach philosophy, in schools. And maybe some high schools will have a philosophy class, but I kept it to myself. It didn't seem like these were the sort of questions that you're permitted to ask. No one was really talking about them. So you might go to a religious studies class, and I took one, and I remember thinking, wow, it's all, it seems relativistic. That was the teacher's take. And so there weren't many classes where I could ask these questions. So I had to kind of do it on my own.
So. That's awesome. So maybe we can start off just by, can you just ground people in what is apologetics? Because maybe some people are hearing that word and they're like, why are we apologizing for Christianity?
Yeah, right.
So what is apologetics all about?
No one wants to do that. No one wants to do that. That's what it's about. Apologetics simply is giving a reasoned defense for what you believe. I mean, that comes from 1 Peter. Always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that is within you. The second part is really important, though, gentleness and respect, because we should be living a certain life, that manifests certain things to people, onlookers. But it's really just, it's giving reasons for what you believe, being able to articulate your faith, and really I would say it's connected with philosophy, namely, being concerned about knowledge, knowing what you believe and why, just thinking about your faith, really. You can just, it's as simple as that, just thinking well about your faith.
Yeah. Which, as comes up all the time on our podcast, what we think and what we believe is inextricably connected to how we behave and
Absolutely.
The choices that we make and how we choose to live. So the two can't be separated. David, is there anything you want to ask before we jump into the brunt of this conversation, or anything you want to add?
I just like to know just a tad more of, or I'd like for the people listening to know a tad more Corey's story, what happened to him after he finished all this in high school, and where did he go? What did he do? What did he learn? All in several minutes.
Everything.
Right.
That's like the question you get after taking a philosophy class. What did you learn? One thing. Like it's all kind of, it starts growing together, and I can't just draw.
Yeah. Just justify your student loans right now.
One thing. Yeah. One statement. I'll give a bit of an overview. Yeah. So where I left off, I'm starting to get into apologetics and listen to some stuff by people like William Lane Craig. J.P. Moreland came up. He was another professor that I studied with. Big name in the apologetics community. So it was during that time I started to think, hey, I need an orientation for my life. If it seems that I'm being prepared to go and get a job, a career, but how does that intersect with vocation? How does that intersect with a bigger picture, the kingdom of God? Or am I just, making money for myself? Like, how is it connected with something bigger than myself? So I decided to go to Bible college for a year and just get some time to think more about my faith and develop that. And I ended up, I went to Heritage, and Dave, of course, is connected with Heritage College and Seminary. And during that time, I just decided to do a degree. After my first year, I was like, this stuff's awesome. This is important. So I stuck with it. Great time there. And I came across Biola's philosophy program, and being impacted again by people like William Lane Craig and JP, and seeing JP Moreland, seeing that they taught there, and that it was in California, which is a huge win. Go to study with some of my heroes and live in California. So that was a no-brainer. So I took out a couple of loans and went down there, and some of the best years of my life. I could get into later some of the stuff that I thought about or areas of mine, but we can get back to that later. But when I moved back from Biola, and that time just really strengthened my faith, and I'm so grateful. The joke is, do you think deeply about unemployment? You have a philosophy degree, right? And I wouldn't trade it for anything. I'm currently not teaching in that sphere. I'd like to, but it has grounded my faith and made me a better person. So I'm so thankful for that time.
Great. Yeah, it's awesome. Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, I'm sure more of your story will come into play, and the things that you were most passionate about while you were studying this will naturally come up in conversation. So let's start here. What are some of the most exciting things that are happening in the apologetics world, specifically that have bearing on maybe some ideas that people just kind of, everyday ordinary people like myself, maybe there's ideas that are kind of traded in the world that we just take for granted as true. Yeah. Or maybe we just don't think deeply about because we're scared to think deeply about them. Because maybe they might undermine our faith. So what is exciting in the apologetics world right now in terms of discoveries? What's being talked about? And how can that help us grow in our own faith? Yeah. Well, in general, again, I like to connect apologetics to philosophy. So I'm going to bring these two into play with one another. Great. But there has been a renaissance in the English-speaking world with regards to philosophy. Over 50 years ago, it was simply not something you would take seriously. God, philosophy, religion, theological issues. There was a philosophy in place having to do with language and what counts as knowledge that kept that out of the room, so to speak. And so a big thing has been the collapse of that philosophy. And today we have top presses like Oxford Press, Cambridge Press, who are not only publishing stuff related to philosophy of religion, but theology.
even stuff on like heaven or oh geez, all kinds of stuff. So that's pretty remarkable that leading Ivy League universities now are publishing high level stuff in the English speaking world related to philosophy, analytic theology. So that's pretty big.
What led to that? Say more about that. Like, what was it 50 years ago that caused that dividing wall? I'm assuming what you're saying is that there was some kind of separation in academia that disallowed certain truths, I suppose, or certain subjects from even being entertained in an intellectual way. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, of course. Of course. Yeah, this philosophy is known as it's a kind of verificationism, but it's called logical positivism. And it was a philosophy which tried to stipulate what is required for a statement to be meaningful, and it happened to leave out a lot of stuff that's important for philosophy and theology. So statements having to do with the existence of God, the nature of God, were thought to be meaningless, not just false, but meaningless. Of course, this philosophy was shown to be incoherent because its own criterion of meaning couldn't be established by its own philosophy. So it kind of imploded, and a number of philosophers were key in that. A number of Christian philosophers coming out of the demolition of that philosophy in the wake of that paved the way forward. People like Alvin Plantinga, very influential philosopher, who's done so much in the field. Nicholas Wolterstorff, William Alston, figures like that. Today it's seen as a respectable thing to be a theist. And there are a number of atheists like Thomas Nagel and others who will say, I'm very uncomfortable that a number of my colleagues at the best schools are committed Christians or theists. We can get pretty nerdy about it, about that kind of current in philosophy, but I think that's pretty important to highlight.
Yeah. So thinking people, the upper echelon of our most educated in that realm, it's become a respectable thing to claim faith.
Yes.
In a transcendent being.
Absolutely. And this was simply like people, like I'm trying to, obviously I wasn't alive during that time, so I don't have experience, but like, when you read some of these people who did come out of that, it's just night and day what the landscape was like, what the culture, the intellectual culture was like. You just could not talk about this stuff. It was just faux pas. It was, so things changed.
So what shifted there? What made it possible so that I can say I believe in God and there's room for me at the academy?
Yeah.
Maybe not everybody respects me, but at least I'm not totally discredited as a clown.
Yeah, a number of things. Well, one was, and again, this is the English speaking world, because we could talk about other streams of philosophy like the continental and so forth. So this is more the English speaking side, the so-called analytic stream of philosophy. But like I said, it was the collapse of this philosophy, logical positivism, which was seen as incoherent and unduly restrictive. So it was the falling apart, the bursting of a bubble, and in that new life was breathed by just rigorous Christian thinkers. So really what it was a collapse of a certain way of thinking, a spirit, if you will. And from that, just really good Christian philosophy coming in. And so people like Alvin Plantinga, who began to, like, for him, he began to argue or articulate a view that belief in God is what is called properly basic, which means that you don't have to have evidence per se. Not everything that is reasonable to believe rests on evidence. So he was trying to argue that belief in God could be justified or warranted without explicit arguments. And again, that was something that was something that had what would you say? that was stipulated by a kind of philosophy. You need to have explicit arguments or something. And so Plantinga said, no, I don't think that's right. And he articulated that extremely well. So that was a big thing. That's called Reformed epistemology, which kind of became a movement. Another thing was people beginning to re-articulate classical arguments for the existence of God. So people like Richard Swinburne is a big figure. William Lane Craig brought back the Kalam cosmological argument. So that was very important as well. Christian thinkers really reviving these older arguments for the existence of God and showing that they haven't been defeated by people like Hume and Kant. And
well, let's talk about some of those then, because I have a feeling that maybe a lot of our audience aren't familiar with some of the old arguments for the existence of God. Maybe they've heard the term, the Kalam cosmological argument, made famous by Bill Craig, but I think it's still worth talking about. And what are some others? Because that can help people. So why don't you share some of those with us?
Yeah. So there are a number. I have a book over here. It's 24 or so arguments for the existence of God. It actually came from a colloquium with Alvin Plantinga. So there are quite a few. So it's kind of, you got to figure out what strikes you, what seem most persuasive. But there are a number. Cosmological arguments are back in. Cosmological arguments are arguments which argue for the existence of God from the cosmos or universe, various features of the universe. Of course, this goes right back to Aquinas and various Muslim thinkers as well. So there are arguments from contingency, which would argue that there must be a necessary being or ground being which accounts for contingent facts. So, for example, everything around us doesn't seem like it has to exist. The book on this table here doesn't have to exist. I could burn it, destroy it. And so when you begin to look about the world, you're going to see that everything that we're in contact with is characterized by this. It's contingent. It didn't have to be. Possibly it could fail to exist or not exist. And so the question is, what accounts for why there is something rather than nothing? And really, this is, you could say, the deepest metaphysical issue. Why does something exist rather than nothing? And it doesn't just stop with the things around us, but the universe itself just seems to be an aggregate of contingent things. So what accounts for that? Is just a brute fact? Or is there a ground of being that all contingent things participate in or depend on? So that can get pretty technical, but I'm just trying to flesh that out. And a number of these arguments do begin in experience. And so a number of people might be able to connect with that. Just the sheer gratuity of things. Like why does things seem so ephemeral? And why is that the case? Is it all just brute, or is there a paradigm existing? Is there something that everything depends on? And I am that I am, if you will.
So is that something like, I think, can please correct me if I get this wrong, but the Kalam cosmological argument stated, as something like everything that exists has a cause, the universe exists, therefore the universe must have a cause. Is it that notion, like you're working your way backwards because everything that is doesn't have to be, it exists because something made it to be?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, there are differences. So again, I pointed out that cosmological arguments are really a family or cluster of arguments. So the Kalam cosmological argument, and I'll just lay it out so people know. It has three premises in Craig's format. One, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Two, the universe began to exist. And three, therefore the universe has a cause. And from that, you try to articulate what that cause must be from the universe we need to explain. So if the universe is matter and energy, space and time. If that all came into being, then we need a spaceless, timeless cause, which set it in motion. So this argument really tries to argue for a first cause on the basis of the impossibility of there being an infinite regress. So there must be a first domino, if you will, something of that sort. While other arguments, cosmological arguments, don't require a beginning. So again, in Craig's version, he's brought in some of the scientific evidence as well. If people might not know this, but there's been a huge set of discoveries which have showed that the universe began to exist a finite time ago. And this is being affirmed over and over again through various discoveries. People have tried to falsify it. And there's Big Bang cosmological model, and there are different models in this vein. But the universe began to exist, and so it needs a cause. So that argument has to do with there being a cause for the beginning of the universe. But there are others, like I said, which just say, suppose that the universe is past eternal. If it's still contingent, it still needs a ground and a being or something to account for it. It could have always existed from the past, so to speak, but because it's contingent, it still needs some explanation. So Thomas Aquinas was someone who didn't think that the Kalam cosmological argument, or it didn't go by the name in his time, wasn't as strong to his mind. But he argued for the existence of God through other means. So it's just, I guess I would say it's helpful just to think of cosmological arguments as a family of arguments that are trying to argue from features of the universe to a first cause or ground of being.
Let's talk through. So let's suppose for a moment that the universe did not begin, because to me the Kalam cosmological argument makes all the sense in the world. And I think it's easy for people to understand.
Oh, absolutely.
You can point to anything and say it exists because something caused it to exist.
Yeah.
And therefore, the spaceless, timeless must be the ultimate cause behind the existence of space and time. Totally easy to get.
Yeah.
Let's suppose for a moment, though, that the universe didn't begin. Let's say that it is, what's the term? Is it solid state? Is that
steady state was a model
steady state
proposed by Fred Hoyle, who became more of an agnostic because of the fine tuning of the universe, which is another argument maybe we could talk about later. But
totally,
state.
I'd love to talk about fine tuning. Yeah, okay. So let's assume that the universe has always existed. What was Aquinas's argument, or what are the arguments for the existence of God, if that is the case?
Yeah. Well, he presents a number of arguments, cosmological arguments, and you'll find that succinctly in his Summa Theologia, I wish I could speak Latin. I probably butchered that, and I don't know exactly where it is. I'm not that big of a nerd, but I'm sure there are Thomists out there who would just know the reference off their heart.
I'm sure if we had Gabe Finocchi on here,
you just quote it. So like I said, for someone like Aquinas, it just wasn't a problem if the universe was infinite in the past, because there are features of the universe which still need to be explained. If again, the contingency of the universe, or another version for him was arguing from potentiality to what he would call pure act. So it seems to be in all things a mixture of potentiality and actuality. This cup is sitting on the table. It has the potential to be destroyed or colored in a different way, and that must exist in the object. So this argument would argue that there must be a ground of actuality which sustains all possibilities or potentialities. And so that argument is consistent with the universe being eternal. So Yeah, I don't see it as a problem. I do believe that I think that the Kalam cosmological argument is a good argument. I think that the science is showing that the universe began to exist. So I would just say there's just a couple more arguments in our tool belt, so to speak.
Right. I guess kind of where my head goes when it comes to arguing for the existence of God and therefore the co-eternal existence of the universe, if indeed the universe never began. How would you separate? How would that not get you into something? Is it panentheism or pantheism that equates God with the existence of matter?
Yeah.
That God is in all those things.
Yeah.
So if God is the actuality that gives rise to all of the possibility, then he would have to be somehow, I don't know, enmeshed in those things if they are co-eternal with one another.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's a great observation. And I would say a couple of things. One, I'm talking about a generic theism. So you're kind of coming in as a Christian and talking about, well, what does the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo say about this? Or creation out of nothing. Isn't that biblical? Isn't that a Christian doctrine? And yeah, I would say that might push us to affirming that the universe did begin to exist. So I would say that, yeah, there are views of God, which this isn't a problem for, but for a certain Christian theistic view, I would say, yeah, it's we would want to argue that the universe did begin to exist. So,
yeah, I have no bone to pick there, other than I believe that the universe began to exist.
Yeah.
I was just curious, what would be the logical ramifications of that view, especially, and I might have it wrong. I mean, my conclusion could be totally incorrect.
But Corey, if Aquinas leaned to that,
that's where I'm going.
Would it not have been because of his dependence on Aristotle?
Well, so I should say that Aquinas affirmed that the universe did begin to exist, and a number of people did push back against Aristotle and some of who thought that the universe was eternal, and various Muslim theologians who affirmed the same thing. And in fact, again, the Kalam argument came out of Muslim theologians who are more orthodox, if you will, because they thought the Quran taught that the universe that was part of what it meant for God to be a creator. And so they did argue against Aristotle that the universe did begin to exist a finite time ago. So
interesting.
Yeah. So Aquinas though thought that he didn't find that argument persuasive. So for him, it was something of faith, if you will. But he did think that there were good arguments for the existence of God, good cosmological arguments. But he just thought that one maybe wasn't the strongest.
What were the holes that Aquinas saw in the Kalam cosmological argument?
You know, that's a good question.
It's okay if you don't know.
Yeah, no, I'm not an Aquinas scholar. So I'm not sure.
Well, then let me rephrase the question. Then, what are some of the holes that people see in that argument today?
In the Kalam cosmological argument.
Yeah, like if we were to play devil's advocate, are there any? Is it watertight or what?
Yeah, I mean, with all these arguments, you know, there are people constantly. It's just like an industry that people writing papers to poke new holes, and it's endless, you know. And sometimes it can get disingenuous, you know. It's like, really, you're just going to bite the bullet and say that things can pop into existence uncaused out of nothing to get around, you know, from that. But,
can I interject something? I think Corey's made an interesting point at the beginning, which is that, you know, a couple generations ago, a theistic viewpoint was, ridiculed in the academic world of philosophy. And the reason being that philosophy and what he referred to as logical positivism is essentially what we would call materialistic in nature. In other words, it states or assumes that the material world, the collection, is just a collection of atoms, and there's nothing more than that to it. And part of the downfall of it is if a philosopher, an atheistic philosopher who espouses his viewpoint, if he or she himself are nothing more than a collection of atoms, how could they come up with all of this wisdom? And that is part of the weakness of it. But the interesting thing to me is that there's a line being drawn across, and I'd like Corey to tease this out. He's already made a couple of allusions to it. There's a line that is drawn between changes in the world of philosophy as pertains to theology and its acceptance of a theistic. And when we talk about theistic, we're not necessarily talking about a Christian viewpoint.
That's right.
We're talking about the belief that a supernatural divine being exists. And it's fine if we demonstrate that, because that gives us a great foundation then to flesh out, the Bible actually informs us who this being is. But there's a line to me drawn from the changes in the dethronement of this materialistic viewpoint with developments in physics, astrophysics, cosmology, and so on, which Sir Fred Hoyle, who used to debate C.S. Lewis in the Second World War, Hoyle was the atheist and debating Lewis, and Hoyle had I wouldn't say, unfortunately, he didn't have a conversion, but he had a conversion of sorts from being atheist to being agnostic, or possibly even leaning toward theism. And he was one of the world's leading astrophysicists. And the reason he had the conversion was because of scientific evidence, purely scientific evidence, because back then he advocated that the universe was eternal. So did Einstein, and they did so. And I'll shut up in a minute, Corey, and let you speak. But Corey's been feeding me this literature, and I've done homework, Stephenson, and I'm reading it. But what I found interesting was that scientific endeavor in the 20th century was based on a philosophy. This is why it's so important to link the philosophy with the science, because philosophical materialism, the kind of stuff that Corey alluded to at the beginning, which is that nothing exists above and beyond what our five senses can access, we're only a collection of atoms, etc. That was a philosophical premise that led Einstein to commit what he described as the biggest blunder of his life. He couldn't reconcile his religious and philosophical views with the discoveries that he was making. And so he cooked the books on his discovery to defend his view that the universe was eternal, because he couldn't countenance the idea that the universe might have had a beginning, because as soon as you admit the universe has a beginning, the question arises, who created it?
The dang theologians were right. They don't want. We're the scientists. We gotta be pushing the button. We can't admit that.
And Hoyle was in the same boat, but scientific discoveries pushed the thing in a different direction, to the point where even Stephen Hawking understood that the universe had a beginning. And then there was a desperate movement to explain how could, given the universe as a beginning, which has now received wisdom, the Big Bang, everybody believes in it now, but Hoyle coined that term as a derisory term. It was a joke. Right. Who could imagine that? Now we realize and accept it. And so the question is, what do we do with it? So I think there's been a difference, the opening up of the philosophy that lay behind this warped view of it warped the science. It warped people's scientific understanding. That philosophy is weakened, and part of the reason it's been weakened is actually because of scientific discoveries, which have just it.
It's just interesting too that at the end of the day, everybody's acting in faith at some level. So their faith is in the idea that matter is eternal and that materialism is correct worldview. But they don't have any proof for that. That's just their presupposition from which they go out from.
Mm-hmm.
And so, at the end of the day, Christianity is going to involve some faith. I can't prove every aspect of what I believe to you, but that is true of every worldview.
Yeah. I think that's important.
So anyway,
I think, there's a number of things there. I think, Dave, you're bringing up a good point. And I would push this narrative back even further, because a lot of people do need to have, I think it's very important, especially as Christians, to have a sense of the history of ideas, because in our context, we might look around and see a number of people and think, well, all the really smart people aren't Christians or whatever. But that, as I said earlier, that's just simply not the case at all.
Not true.
But if we go back and we get an overview of the history of thought, we see that the greatest luminaries have been some form of theist. Maybe not a Christian view, but the materialistic view is really the most, what would you say?
Lazy?
Well, not lazy, but it hasn't been the majority view. The majority of the great philosophers weren't materialists, and this debate goes right back to the Greek philosophers. You had some of the pre-Socratics, like Thales and others, who argued that, well, everything must be made out of this element or another. Everything's water. And then you had the atomists like Democritus and Leucippus, who argued that everything was atoms in the void. So thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who believed in something like God. As Christians, we could poke here and there, but they were not materialists. They believed that ultimate reality was spiritual, transcendent. This realm of transcendence, which all finite reality participates in and is moved by. In him we live and move and have our being. There's something more than the material world. It is not ultimate. So that goes right back to the beginning. So a lot of people don't realize that there are a number of erroneous philosophical ideas which have gripped and taken a hold of science. There are a number of I've been reading a number of these books, but non-Christian, I guess you would say they're spiritual religious people, who've written books like Science Set Free or Science and Spirituality, the latter being the work of this psychologist in a major university in the UK. He's and the former being a book by Rupert Sheldrake, who was a Cambridge trained biologist, and they argue that science is held captive by what is called a mechanical picture of reality. So it's a kind of materialistic philosophy. Everything is rock bottom, the kind of mechanism. And so they argue that this science doesn't need this. And they list out, I'd have to find the book. They list a number of propositions that are believed to be the case, taken on faith, if you will, by a number of people who are practicing, who aren't aware of this, people in the sciences, who aren't aware of this philosophical worldview, and they take it for granted. And it's just philosophically, it's unnecessary. The science, as Dave pointed out, in these fields, whether it's cosmology or, for me, philosophy of mind and soul, is a big thing. And here's another one where current scientific work is showing that we are more than our brains. So the science as well is starting to overturn that philosophy. So yeah, I do think there is a faith component. I think a lot of people who are good in their domains as scientists are unaware of these larger worldview issues that Dave has mentioned. And I think as Christians, we need to be aware of that and articulate that, and maybe not allow ourselves to get bullied by a kind of presumption of authority, and scientists speaking outside of their area of expertise.
Mm-hmm. And in his book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, Dr. Meyer, which you're more familiar with than I am, Corey, but he gives a potted history of modern science and points out that almost all of the scientists through the last few hundred years have been either theists or actual Christians.
Absolutely.
And that, I read, I wish I'd written it down, but I read a statement the other day from some prominent thinker that that the root of most progress in Western civilization stems from the Reformation. Not the Enlightenment, but the Reformation, because it was in the Reformation that people were taught to read. Why were they taught to read? Because so they could read the Bible, and a biblical view of reality is a view. It's logical, rational. It shows God as creator of an orderly world.
Absolutely.
And all the early scientists, people like Sir Isaac Newton and great luminaries in the scientific world, the reason there was scientific progress, which came from within the Christian mindset, was because of belief in the Bible put forth of an orderly cosmos that could be explained. And it wasn't just all karma, as in, say, Indian philosophy and religion, and inexplicable, but it actually there was a structure and order which could be discovered. And I find it interesting that even modern, cutting edge, if I could put it that way, apparently developments in modern science are moving in the direction of demonstrating a biblical worldview, in spite of the fact that most of the people aren't even theists themselves. And like you said, it's making some of them very uncomfortable. Somebody said, well, almost like the Bible got it right in Genesis.
If I could just dwell on this, because I think this is so important, Dave. And I know we talked about some of the arguments for existence of God, but and I'm not really an expert on those, but I do find some of them very compelling. But I find that there are background issues which, to me, really underscore my belief in God. And one of those is, as I become more confident that science actually discloses or gets us truth, the more confident I am that there must be a transcendent intelligence, for a number of the reasons you pointed out. So, as you pointed out, historically, and this is simply a fact, one that even puzzled Marxist scholars, why did science emerge in Europe, in the place it did? And it was because Christianity, the Judeo-Christian tradition, I should say, laid a number of premises or presuppositions. It gave a worldview within which science could be birthed. And you pointed out a number of those things. One, that the universe is a creation by a rational mind, or logos, which is an important word biblically and philosophically. Logos, wisdom, order, insight. In the beginning was the logos. This finite world is created by a rational being or mind, and we are created in the image and likeness of this being, and we are here as stewards to, among other things, discover, to create culture, including science and civilization, to discover the world. So our minds mirror or participate in the divine logos or mind of God, and we can have faith to do science, confidence to do science. You got to ask yourself, it's a really bizarre commitment that scientists have when they say things like, or they have this confidence that they can know the deep structure of things, mathematical structure, that we can know, that we can articulate the math involved in a black hole. How is it that, evolved, if we're just nothing but evolved monkeys, if you will, how is it that this local phenomenon of survival of the fittest came to produce beings like ourselves that can articulate and know the deep mathematical structure of the world, know this deep order? There's a deep interconnectedness of things we should begin to see, that our minds are able to reflect and penetrate. That was a Christian conviction. So there are so many faith commitments in science today that really are given a framework within Christianity.
Let's say more about that
Sure.
that example, if we could, Corey, because you brought up evolution. where is the science at with that? And what is the Christian to say to that whole topic?
Yeah, I've spent a good amount of time studying evolution. I mean, that was one of the big issues that came up back in high school for me, a big stumbling block. It's important to understand at the outset there are different understandings of evolution. So people say things like, well, it's a fact. It's not a theory, it's a fact. Well, it depends what you mean by evolution. Change over time, of course. We see this, we can observe this. Darwin observed finch beaks change cyclically according to different environmental conditions. Or we see fossils of things that no longer exist. And this might be a contentious topic among Christians, how old the earth is. I myself am an old earther, and Dave would be the Bible guy, so he'd be the one to talk to on the Genesis stuff. But we have evolution in terms of change over time, and none of that should be problematic to Christians. None of that should threaten the doctrine of creation. I think the problem is with a Darwinian view, which says that there is no purpose and that these mechanisms of natural selection acting on random mutation are truly creative and can produce all that we see in the biosphere. So someone like Richard Dawkins has called this the blind watchmaker hypothesis, that the design we see in nature isn't real, it's only apparent. So I think that is a problem for a Christian view of creation. But evolution in terms of gradual change, or there being an old earth, that shouldn't be a problem. It's really the mechanism. What is the driving force of this process? So yeah, we could get more into that, but
go ahead, David.
My understanding of the debate is that Darwin's view is discredited, and most scientists, even those that aren't Christians or theists, have moved on from it, and they're casting around for a replacement because they're worried that if they don't come up with something to replace it, that views of people like us are going to take over.
Yeah, that's the worry.
So,
that's the worry.
But I know what people need to hear. They're listening. Is the classical view of evolution that's presented is Darwinian evolution. When Corey says evolution, he's talking about there can be change within a species. There can be change, incremental change, but not the kind of changes that Darwin proposed.
Right.
And that this mysterious, the odds of, and Corey, you can address this, but the odds of the random natural selection is not an intelligent process as Darwin presented it. What happens is that, life throws up these quote unquote random mutations. So the atoms, revolve around and, like bingo, celestial bingo or something, and something comes up and natural selection just intersects with this change of molecules and brings about a magical change. The problem is that the more people have studied, molecular biology, chemistry, and even mathematical theory, by my understanding, Corey, if you can correct me, is that they've computed the odds of intelligent life forming out of chaos, out of random molecules over the 13.8 billion year history of the universe. The odds of life as we know it now, intelligent life, which is the three of us very highly intelligent people talking to each other, the odds are astronomical. I mean, they are one out of 10 to the 40th or 80th.
It's basically incalculable.
Incalculable odds. that the process that Darwin described could actually have happened.
Yes.
And so it didn't happen that way. And so if it didn't happen that way, the alternative has to be that life had this big head start, so to speak, and it can only be explained by an intelligent creator who put all the conditions in place that have led to the existence of life as we know it.
Absolutely. A number of things to say. Darwin's view, and his book is really one long argument for his theory of evolution, because of course there have been various theories of evolution scientifically, and actually evolution is a philosophy as well, and some of this has backdrops and just a kind of progressive outlook that was taking over Europe, and things were inexorably progressing towards a certain end. So evolution is intertwined with philosophy as well. Any big worldview issues are going to start intersecting with philosophy. But Darwin's view was one long argument that took in a number of things into consideration. But essentially what he was arguing was that all life forms go back to a single, universal, common ancestor. That the driving force of the diversification of the biosphere is natural selection acting on randomly arising mutations. He didn't really know much about the mutation stuff that came later by Gregor Mendel, who was a Catholic, a committed Catholic. He laid modern view of genetics. But Darwin's view, you could sum it up as being kind of one big extrapolation, like a man jumping off a table, flapping his wings, and then you say, well, that just a little bit more of that thing, and you can account for flight. It's kind of ridiculous. It's a huge extrapolation. So, well, we have human breeders, and we can breed dogs the way we like it. And so suppose that there is a wild breed, and maybe the animal with the most fur survive the winters, and we extrapolate and we get a whole new dog. It's like, okay, well, that's one thing, but really everything in life. So minimally, I guess I want Christians to know that it's really a secular creation story. And Darwin, there's theology all throughout Darwin's book, anti-theological arguments in a purely scientific book. But it's minimally as any. You might read some of these people who were journalists or even law professors who've written these books like Examining Darwin and so forth. I can't think of their names on the top of my head, but just people who wanted to look at the evidence as a layperson, not as a biochemist, whatever. And you just come away seeing that it's a lot. It's a big faith commitment. And so
let me just ask there real quick. So when somebody says evolution is a fact, and what they mean is that it is a fact that human beings arose from apes or a shrew or something like that. That is in fact false. It is not a fact that human beings arose from some other life form.
Well, that again is another in-house Christian issue. I know there are some that want to argue for the special creation of mankind. I don't think for you to be a theist and believe in creation that you need a first human pair. So again, this is getting back to.
No, I'm just asking: is it a scientifically proven fact?
Oh no,
that humans are right.
No,
so that's a ridiculous thing to say.
Yeah, no, it's definitely not. And I know William Lane Craig has written a big book on this. It is a controversial book in evangelical Christian circles, but he.
Yes, I've heard of the controversy.
Yeah, but his whole point is that nothing in modern science undermines a historical Adam and Eve. And so his conclusion or point is modest, but it's just not simply a fact. So again, we see things changing over time. We see fossils of species that went extinct. But this idea that Darwin's map, if you will, his overarching view, his picture, his image, is simply not. It's not a fact. There are facts that he incorporates, Of course,
Sure.
again, Finch beaks changing in size and so forth. There's a lot of this, but to say that,
I don't think any sane person has any issue with adaptation over time.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So I think it is important to realize that, well, again, if you don't believe, this is where the philosophy comes in. If you have excluded belief in a creator, something like this has to be true. And this goes back to the Atomists.
Which comes back to faith.
Yeah, it's a faith story. And this goes back to some of the Atomists. They had an evolutionary story because it flows. You can't just have things. It's too improbable to have something come into being from, all these things come together, as Fred Hoyle gave this illustration of, you're in a junkyard and a tornado goes through and you have a plane come out. So you need this gradual story of successive adaptation and modification. It has to be the case if you don't believe in a transcendent creator or intelligence. So again, as Christians, we actually have freedom to look at the evidence, and we shouldn't be worried about that. So I think it's important for your listeners to be aware that that general story is simply not a fact, and we should have the confidence and to look at the evidence and make up our minds about that, and not get bullied into thinking that it's simply established. Right. May I add real quick here, Jake? Just a point of because some people might be like, "Oh, well, Corey, you're a philosopher and theologian." Maybe I shouldn't say I'm a philosopher. I have degrees in that. Maybe that's too lofty. But you're not a scientist. Well, people need to be aware of the fact that there have been a number of high-profile conferences at the Royal Society and in Cambridge. One of the last Royal Society meetings, which was something started by Sir Isaac Newton, or something that Newton himself attended. So it's very prestigious. Had some of the leading thinkers in evolution come, and it was all about, as David pointed out, the fact that the Darwinian story has not explained a number of very important things, like not just that there, are various breeds of dogs, but where did you get the dog body plan from, or how do you account for fundamental animal body plans themselves, or the origin of life, or all of these things. And so they just admitted that the standard Darwinian story is simply inadequate to account for these things. So none of them are. Well, there might have been a few Christians there, but this was not a Christian. This wasn't an intelligent design conference. This was a Royal Society meeting where some of the leading thinkers came and just expressed their bewilderment, or they were proposing alternative mechanisms or ideas. But the point is that this Darwinian view really is crumbling at the height. So just as we're having a renaissance in philosophy with regards to religious epistemology and arguments for God, and we're now seeing the crumbling of the Darwinian view through just non-Christian thinkers who are just admitting that we need to account for this. Like this view is just not doing it. So that's pretty big, and it's not well known.
It is big, right?
Would it be accurate, Corey? Well, I've got it straight that Stephen Einstein and later Stephen Hawking, who developed Einstein's thinking further, came to the conclusion that the universe could not have existed without some kind of intelligent input into it. But because Hawking, for instance, was reluctant to, I'll put it mildly, was reluctant to entertain the idea of Judeo-Christianity being correct. But he had to come up with an explanation now. The universe has a beginning. The fine-tuning, and maybe you can get into that, but the fine-tuning, the set of conditions that had to be in place for the universe to generate life as we know it today was so highly improbable. The odds, not just for one, but for, 10, 15, or 20 different conditions were so extraordinarily improbable that Hawking came to the conclusion in his PhD thesis and beyond that, and in collaborative work with some of the top minds in Britain at the time, that that there was an intelligence behind the construction of the universe, but because he couldn't entertain the idea of the biblical account being true for religious and philosophical reasons, not scientific reasons, he proposed that the origin of this intelligence must have come from alien life or other universes.
Yes. Oh.
So, but this is, people laugh at it.
Directed panspermia. That's the view, and it sounds like out of a
Sorry, what?
Yeah,
Directed panspermia,
and that's right out of a sci-fi movie by the sounds of it. But yeah, it
that's almost as bad as the theological term interpenetration that I talked about with David and Chris the other day.
It's a similar idea, but you laugh at it. But I mean, this is actually serious. This is the alternative that is being presented by cosmologists who have an extreme aversion to a biblical point of view, but who understand that there had to have been a creative intelligence behind the universe as it stands today at the moment of its inception 13.8 billion years ago, that put in all of these improbable conditions. And so where does it come from? And I just think this is ridiculous. Here are these highfalutin intellectuals who make mockery of us. So I've just come from Tennessee, down the road from where the Scopes monkey trial was. And we have been made mockery of for nearly 100 years, since that event took place. And yet now it turns out that, we were right and Darwin was wrong. And the people that are opposing us are now proposing that aliens were behind all.
Well, because they evolved, so that's okay.
Either that, or they're positing some kind of like multiverse scenario where the likelihood of one universe producing intelligent life is low. But if we're just one universe of lots and lots and lots of universes, well, then maybe the chances are higher.
Which, of course,
and that's scientific.
Because where did they come from?
Yeah, so
it's just backing up the problem one more step.
Passing the buck, We were seeded here by aliens like Prometheus. Well, where'd those aliens come from? Well, they evolved. Mm-hmm. So we're not explaining it. So again,
Corey, this is what people are actually saying in high scientific circles. Some people are saying.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There are people who have speculated with these things. Of course, I think it was might have been Francis Crick or James Watson, one of the discoverers of the structure of DNA, who toyed with directed panspermia. So. They played around with it. I don't want to say that it's established, but anything to get away from what the evidence is pointing towards. If it's an evolved alien race, that's fine, but it can't be the prime reality. There can't be an intelligence can't be fundamental, which again, getting back to how we think about science, it's like, okay, so that's a real problem for you. That intelligence is fundamental to reality. That should give you more cause to do science. But I think it becomes a faith thing. People don't want there to be God, and this goes right back to the Greeks as well. People who are trying to flee God. God probably doesn't exist, so get on with your life. That was Epicurus. Don't worry about the gods. Their gods were pretty nasty, though. It wasn't the God who loved us and sent his son for us, and gives himself. So maybe you would want those gods to be done away with, but they don't want God to exist. And some thinkers are quite candid. Someone like Thomas Nagel himself, brilliant philosopher, said, I don't want there to be a God. I just don't want to live in that world. This divine authority problem. So, yeah.
As someone who is, you think philosophically a lot about, you said, the human soul. Does that mean that you spend a bit of time thinking about other arguments for the existence of God, like moral arguments? Or maybe we could start to land our plane going down that avenue.
Sure.
Because I find those arguments absolutely compelling, maybe even more compelling than the cosmological category.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Jake. Some of these things, the arguments can be presented simply, like you said, like the Kalam's pretty simple, 3 premises. but you can go pretty in depth with them. And so I haven't spent a lot of time recently looking at the arguments for the existence of God. Maybe some of the ones that Craig spends a lot of time on, per se. I guess the moral argument would be an exception because that's one I've spent time on. But I find that there are a number of other considerations which affirm the reality of God more so. So religious experiences are a huge one for me. I spent a lot of time doing my second master's looking at religious and mystical experience, and I've simply gotten to the point where enough people, it'd be like you're getting all these reports about this faraway country, like people going to the new world before we had North America, and you put all these reports together, and it's like there's too many reports. There has to be this body of land. So to me, reading lots and lots of different forms of religious experience, that's become a very important reason for belief in God myself. But considerations from consciousness, that to me is extremely powerful, and I'll put it quite simply for the audience. If in the beginning, as Dave said, you have matter and energy in the void, you have atoms which stand in external relations to one another, and if you have this causal story where those atoms come together into more complex structural aggregates over time, you're going to get more and more complicated structures of the same kind, right? But then at some point in time, I mean, we're sitting around. I mean, I'm at least aware that I'm conscious. I don't know about you guys. At least I'm aware that I'm conscious and thinking. But we got consciousness where we're aware of things. What philosophers would call qualia, so the what it's like or the feel of something, that what it's like to have experience of pain, to be aware of the color red. That doesn't seem to be identical to a neuronal state firing in your brain, a C fiber firing. So consciousness seems to be this thing which is radically different from the material world. So how did we get something from nothing? How did we get something qualitatively different? A logical, like take a series of thoughts, like if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. These thoughts are different than brain states, because
this is what you meant earlier when you said that science is discovering we're more than a brain.
Well, I would say these are philosophical considerations, but there are important empirical discoveries which reinforce. I'm what you would call a substance dualist, so I believe that you could argue that the biblical view is tripartite, body, soul, and spirit, but the biblical view is that we are not simply material. So I believe that we are not just have a soul, but are souls. And our souls are embodied or inform our bodies. And in that soul are various drawers, so to speak. So think of it like a chest of drawers. And so you have different powers within the soul. And so there can be grades of soul. I think animals have souls. I think anything where the whole is ontologically more fundamental than the parts, the whole organism, if you will, or substance is more fundamental. You have a soul, and this goes right back to Aristotle himself, de anima. There are grades of souls, and so we have certain capacities that the animals don't. But those are philosophical considerations. I think they're very strong, and I think they should inform the science, or I think they're more compelling or authoritative than the scientific considerations. Which is an important thing to point out, because I think in our day and age where we point to science or go to the science immediately, it is important to realize that philosophy can have independent and authoritative considerations for something. So the nature of consciousness being non-physical, and that we are souls and are not merely physical, I think are one of those important considerations from philosophy. But if I could just get back to the argument real quick, and then maybe I'll turn it back to you for some clarification. We're trying to account for how we got aggregates of atoms coming together in greater structures, and we're getting something out of nothing. Consciousness, which can think, and do science. How do we explain that? And to me, quite simply, without making it too complicated, if in the beginning was logos or spirit, as Hebrews says, what is invisible comes from the invisible. If we have something like consciousness at the root of reality, it's not a problem to explain how we get finite versions of that later on, as God creates us in His image. It shouldn't be odd for a Christian view of things as to how we would get conscious agents later on, because that is fundamental to reality. Whereas in the materialistic view, again, you have this problem of how do we get this thing which is so radically different from what the prime reality is supposed to be, namely matter and energy, atoms in the void, bumping around with no real telos or purpose or conscious awareness.
Yeah, how does, by the way, Jake has lost power, and you'd think he was Pentecostal, might have some power, but anyway, he's lost power. This happened last week because of all the terrible weather in California. So we've got to keep persevering here until he reappears.
It is still recording?
By faith. It's still recording, and we're just fine. So we just keep going, and he's going to get back on. So it's like when Einstein's theory, relativity, the E was mc squared, but that's very simple. But actually, all the profound truth behind it, and all the multiple thousands of equations and so on that he had to work through to get to that, it involved energy and mass, his equation. But the question is, how did a random bundle of energy and mass, which would be Einstein's brain, manage to transcend the random placing of atoms and energy within his physical being to come up with a profound understanding of truth? And where do things like our understanding of beauty come from? That we understand that the Rocky Mountains display a splendor or a beauty, whereas the local sewage disposal plant doesn't. But we think about that. We take that for granted, don't we? Mm-hmm. But where did that come from? Like, where did that arise? Why would a random coming together of atoms, if that's all we are, why would it tell people across the world that the Rocky Mountains display beauty, whereas the sewage disposal plant does not express beauty? Where's that come from? It's the kind of thing you're saying, isn't it? And I think that those kind of considerations are relevant. They are relevant, and they should count for something, because it's common sense apart from anything else, I think. And would you say that modern science, modern secularistic science, because there's a difference between science and what I call scientism, which is a philosophy that the world is nothing more than material in nature, that God doesn't exist, and everything has natural causes. That is not a scientific analysis. That is a philosophical statement. Correct? Am I correct?
Of course. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. But what is presented to us by people who advocate that is that is a scientific statement.
Yeah.
They don't admit it's actually a philosophical point of view. When you alluded to the fact of evolution being philosophical in nature, and it absolutely was. It didn't go back to Darwin. It went back to Hegel, who was, a preeminent philosopher who developed an idea of the evolving, ever upward evolving nature of human history. And in the 19th century, it was all progress and things are getting better and all the rest of it. And Darwin just took that philosophical idea and applied it to biology. Karl Marx took it and applied it in a different way to politics. But it was a philosophy. And of course, it was an untrue philosophy, because if history was evolving upward and upward and upward, then in the 20th century, we would never have had Adolf Hitler and the Holocaust. And now we've got Putin, and so it doesn't look like things are actually getting better. They may, in fact, be getting worse. So that's all by the by today. I mean, people are not advocating, we hope things may get better, but Darwin's, theory was philosophically based. And one of the things that has to be said today, and as Christians, we can take confidence in the fact that, science itself is neutral. Science just means knowledge. It's neutral. It's scientific discovery is neutral in nature, or it should be. It's just a set of facts. It's a set of data. And how do we interpret those data? And if you choose to come at the data from a religious or philosophical presupposition, then at least you should be honest enough to say, I'm just not neutral here. I am actually coming from a philosophical presupposition, religious presupposition, which is atheism, atheism has got nothing to do with science, even though they say atheists equal a scientific viewpoint. Atheism is as much a statement of faith or theology or philosophy as Christian belief is.
Dave, it is important to work through these things, but I've gotten to a point where the science religion thing is just, it is not an issue whatsoever. And I meet people in this, well, what about science and faith or science and religion? It's not a problem once you work through the issues. Generally. So I think you're right. Science, and to be honest, like I don't even think it's right to say that there is a thing called science. I think there are sciences. There is no single method of science. There are methodologies. You could break science up into two domains, largely, the historical sciences and the experimental sciences. And what they're about is very different. So in the experimental, you might be doing things repeated over and over again, things that you could reproduce. Like you drop a ball over and over again and, try to articulate that through a mathematical equation like Newton did. Now that's still leaving a number of things out. You have a formal explanation. You have a mathematical formula, but you still haven't explained that causally. So that's only one dimension. And then you have things like historical sciences, which might involve things that you can't reproduce. They're singular or unique, like forensic science, like a certain murder. There were, unique people involved. Maybe some things that were pretty wild or out there that you couldn't just repeat identically. And of course, not that event or the Big Bang itself. We can't put that in a test tube. We can't, we'll reproduce the results. Like, no, that's a high level historical theory, which is trying to make sense of, it looks at data or features of the world and tries to explain them through an inference to the best explanation. What explains these things that are now in existence? What do we postulate that would explain that? So there is no thing called science. There are sciences and different methodologies. And I think it's important because so long as we think that there is this thing called science and it's insular and there's something called philosophy or theology, these things are deeply interconnected. And we're not going to be able to have an integrated view of things or even a university, a curriculum where things are connected if we think that things are that segregated. It's not as if I don't think you can point out certain things as being science, but again, when push comes to shove, I think it's simply incorrect to say that there is this one thing called science or this one thing called the scientific method itself.
Well, my faith has been rewarded.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Yeah, good. Good to have you back.
I don't even know what happened. Our whole building just lost power again. That's the second week in a row.
Oh, geez. Someone doesn't want this conversation to keep going, I guess.
It's the devil.
It must be. Jake, before you close this out, I want to make one pitch here, which is there are, we're having this discussion because followers of Jesus, people like Plantinga and Wallerstorff, great Reformed people, of course, I'll put that plug in, but, and that's no accident, because Reformed theology teaches that, the kingdom of God goes to every sphere. But they've got ahead of us, pioneers. And people like Corey have invested years of their life. He's got degrees from several institutions, including the highly prestigious University of Toronto, from which I myself have 2 degrees. That's why I say it's highly prestigious. But I want to make a pitch here to people that are listening to be, a friend of mine said to me when I was a young Christian, we have no fear of truth as Christians. Pursue truth wherever it leads, because it will lead to the one who is the way, the truth, and the life. And I don't think we need to stick our head in the sand and be afraid of the big bad, evolutionary people or other whatever is boogeymen out there, postmodern, cancel culture, etc. We need to be aggressive in getting into these things. And if there's people listening, let me encourage you. If you want to reach out to Corey, you can contact him through Jake or myself, for some encouragement in pursuing the kind of things that he's been doing. Maybe there's Christians out there that want to pursue higher degrees in science and some, let's get out there. Let's invade the academy. Don't cop out. Don't, become a holy huddle. And don't segregate your faith either. Don't sort of say, well, I'll be one thing, in my scientific view, but I'll keep my religious faith on the side. No, don't do that. Don't be afraid of bringing your perspective in, because the fact of the matter is that we believe that the picture the Word of God presents, Bible isn't a science book, but it presents a picture of truth. Ultimately, if it is true, it will be validated by scientific discovery. And I strongly believe that that is actually what we're seeing unfolding in front of our eyes in a way that has never before occurred in history. And I think it's absolutely extraordinary. The discoveries that have been made in the last decade, 2-3 decades, are validating a biblical worldview in a sense that has never been possible before. And some preeminent scientists who are not even Christians have said exactly that. Professor Lennox of Oxford, in his book, in his books, refers to, I think, the Natural History Museum in London, which I visited with my grandchildren. It's the greatest natural history museum, I think, in the world. The director of it wrote a book called The Genesis Enigma, saying, how is it that Genesis 1 got it right? Man's not a Christian. He's an evolutionary biologist. So I'm just saying this is a pitch for Christians to get out there and pursue truth and be aggressive. And anyway, here endeth the lesson. I'll keep it.
Yes, and if anybody can live with an integrated worldview, it is Christians. One of the things that I think the naturalists are participating in is a disjointed life from what they believe. So you believe that we are nothing but atoms, just material beings, and yet you still go home and kiss your wife and say you love her. What is that? What is love? That's, you're just experiencing some chemical reaction in your brain. If you're nothing more than a brain, nothing more than material. Whereas we get to live and we actually believe in something called love, not in the sense that it's our neurons firing, but that God is the originator of love. And so we can live, I just use that as an example to say that we can live with an integrated view of life and surely can pursue truth into every sphere that it takes us and be confident that it's going to point us back to the existence of God.
Amen. And I would just encourage listeners, as Dave has as well. We as Christ said, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. And at times I can get a bit frustrated by the landscape in which we live, because I think we are living at a time when belief in God or the transcendent is so powerful. And we've talked about a number of things in the sciences, from astrophysics, cosmology. I mentioned some of the stuff having to do with consciousness. We talked about evolution. A big one for me has been something like near-death experiences. which has in this field led a number of atheists or agnostics to become some form of theists because the evidence suggests that there is life after death. And not only that, but people have experienced God through this experience. So to me, it's just right for Christians and thinkers to get out there and to push back and to overcome the secular, materialistic, Epicurean cosmos, and to see that we live in a universe which is beautiful and orderly and participates in the being of God, and that truth, beauty, and goodness is fundamental. And so yeah, I would just encourage Christians to get out there and do their best because we don't have to live in fear. The evidence and the considerations of science really is on our side. And so I'd like to see some of that get pushed back and things turned into culture.
Great. Well, Corey, maybe we can have you back again at some point in the future to have you talk more about those mystical or near-death experiences that you're describing, and because that certainly seems like something worth diving
Absolutely.
into. I'd love to talk about that, and particularly in the context of Christianity as well, in terms of what Christianity would have to say about that.
Yeah.
But super interesting and awesome. Corey, if people do want to reach out to you or engage with your thoughts more, is there anywhere they can find you online, even if it's just your social media handle or something like that, if they want to DM you?
Yeah, of course. You can find me on Facebook, Corey Stephenson. Just look for this face. Or you can message me, email me, corestep, CORESTEP @gmail.com. Feel free to do so. I consider myself a resource guy more than anything. I know Dave mentioned that. I love getting people in touch with good books and trying to find the best resources for people to get in and start studying and thinking through things themselves. So if anyone wants help or direction in that, just feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to help you out and encourage you and put some good material in your hands.
Wonderful. All right. Well, you guys just got the open invite to bombard Corey's inbox.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So we'll see if he ends up regretting that. Anyway, Corey, thank you so much for coming on today, man. We really, really do appreciate it. And thank you all for listening. We really appreciate you guys continuing to engage with our thought. We love doing this podcast. Please do go subscribe to our YouTube channel, Good Theology. Rate and like the show. It helps us out a ton. And of course, thank you so much to Dwell Bible for sponsoring today's episode. God bless you, everybody. Bye-bye.